Imagine you are a German soldier in the autumn of 1944. The Allies are pushing hard through Normandy. Your unit has just overrun an American position somewhere west of St. Lo. The air smells of sulfur and wet earth, and something sharper, something metallic, something you have learned to associate with death. Foxholes scarred into the mud, scattered equipment, shell casings everywhere. And there among the fallen men in olive drab who will never stand again. You step carefully between the bodies. Your Carabiner 98K hangs heavy on your shoulder. 5 rounds in the internal magazine. Bolt action. The same fundamental design your grandfather carried in the trenches of the First Great War. You have been shooting it for 2 years now, and you are fast. 15 aimed rounds per minute on a good day. That is considered excellent, but something catches your eye in the mud. A rifle. American. You have heard about this weapon. Your officers warned you about it before you crossed the hedgerows. They said it sounded like a machine gun in the hands of a single man. They said a squad of Americans armed with these rifles could produce fire so dense, so relentless, that entire German platoons had been pinned down believing they faced heavy machine gun emplacements. You pick it up. It is heavier than your Carabiner. 9.5 pounds of American steel and walnut. But it is beautiful, sleek, modern. You can feel the precision in every surface, the confidence of the engineering. This is not a weapon that was designed in haste. This was built by someone who understood machines the way a musician understands an instrument. You search the fallen American soldier. In his bandolier, you find 8 rounds of .30 caliber ammunition already loaded into a small metal clip, a piece of stamped steel roughly the size of your palm. You manage after some fumbling to press the clip down into the open receiver. The bolt snaps forward with a satisfying authority. You raise the rifle. You aim. You fire. The recoil pushes into your shoulder. The bolt flies back on its own, ejects the spent brass chambers the next round automatically. You do not touch a thing. You fire again. And again. The speed is astonishing. You are putting rounds down range faster than you ever imagined possible from a rifle. No bolt to cycle, no interruption, no break in your sight picture. Just pull the trigger, and the weapon does the rest. 8 rounds disappear in seconds. Then a sound you have never heard from any rifle on any battlefield. Ping. A small metal clip launches itself from the top of the open receiver, tumbles through the autumn air, and lands in the dirt beside your boot. The rifle is empty. The bolt is locked back, its mouth open and waiting. You look down at the bandolier. The remaining rounds are loose, not loaded into any clip. And without the clip, you cannot reload this weapon. Not here. Not in the field. Not under fire. Not at all. You have just held the most powerful individual infantry weapon of the Second World War. You have fired it. You have felt its terrible, beautiful power, and you cannot use it. That small piece of stamped metal, that clip tumbling through the air, is the reason why. And to understand how a piece of steel the size of a man's palm became the most effective security feature any weapon has ever had, you have to go back 56 years before this moment. Back to a small farm in Quebec, Canada. Back to a boy who was about to lose his mother. And from that loss, begin a journey that would change the nature of infantry warfare forever. If you love military history, if you care about the weapons that shaped the world and the men who designed them, subscribe to this channel and hit the bell. We bring these stories to you every week. And this story of a bobbin boy who became the most important weapons designer of the 20th century, may be the most remarkable of them all. Let us begin. Saint-Rémy, Quebec. New Year's Day, 1888. The snow lies thick across the farmlands south of Montreal. In a small house on a modest farm, a boy is born to Jean-Baptiste Garand and Elizabeth Hedwig Oligny. They name him Jean Cantius Garand. He enters the world as the eldest son of what will become a family of 12 children, 6 boys and 6 girls. Every one of the Garand boys carries the same baptismal first name, Saint Jean le Baptiste, in the tradition of French-Canadian Catholic families. But only this boy will go by the name Jean. The others will use their middle names. Only this one will carry the family name into history. Saint-Rémy sits at the far southern edge of Quebec in the Montérégie region, an almost exclusively French-speaking community where life moves to the rhythm of seasons and soil. Jean-Baptiste Garand farms. Elizabeth raises children. The winters are long and brutal. The summers are short and demanding. It is a life of honest labor and quiet endurance, the kind of life that builds a certain kind of character in a certain kind of person. The Garand family lives near something unusual for rural Quebec: a gun club. Local marksmen leave their rifles at the Garand home between matches. Jean and his brothers grow up around firearms the way other farm boys grow up around horses and plows. They learn to shoot. One of his brothers will later operate a shooting gallery. The mechanical fascination with guns takes root early. But it is not guns that first reveal the boy's extraordinary mind. It is the machines. Even as a young child, Jean watches how things work. He studies the mechanisms of the farm, the way one moving part triggers another, the way energy transfers from hand to tool to earth. He understands intuitively what engineers spend years learning in universities: that mechanical systems follow logic. That complexity can be made reliable. That precision is not a luxury, but a discipline. Several of his brothers share the same inventive streak. Creativity runs deep in the Garand bloodline. But Jean possesses something beyond creativity. He possesses patience, the willingness to study a problem from every angle, to discard what does not work to begin again without bitterness. He does not know it yet, but that patience will one day be tested beyond anything he can imagine. In 1899, tragedy strikes. Elizabeth Hedwig Oligny, mother of 12, dies. John is 11 years old, 12 children, one father, a farm in Quebec that cannot sustain them all. Jean-Baptiste Garand makes the decision that millions of immigrant fathers have made before and since. He sells everything. He gathers his children, and he crosses the border into the United States of America. They settle in Jewett City, Connecticut. Why Connecticut? Because the textile mills of New England are hiring. Every hand counts, even small ones. And in America, there is a promise that does not exist on a Quebec farm: the promise that a man or a boy can become something more than what he was born into. This is the foundational story of America. A family shattered by loss arriving with nothing, stepping into a country that offers opportunity in exchange for labor. Millions of families have lived this story. Millions of men watching this right now carry the memory of a grandfather or a father who did exactly what Jean-Baptiste Garand did, who packed up grief and children and crossed a border in search of something better. Jean Garand begins his American life sweeping floors in a Connecticut textile mill. He is 11 years old. He attends school for one more year. At 12, he leaves school permanently and goes to work full-time. No diploma, no formal education beyond the 6th grade. English is his second language, learned on the factory floor between the roar of looms and the hiss of steam. Picture that mill, the deafening clatter of mechanical looms running 10-12 hours a day, the smell of machine oil and raw cotton, drive belts spinning overhead connected to a central steam engine that powers everything, dim light filtering through high windows caked with fiber dust, child workers moving between the machines, dodging moving parts that could take a finger or a hand in an instant. This is not the environment that produces genius, except when it does. Jean Garand does not merely work in the mill. He watches. He studies the machinists who maintain the looms, the way they diagnose problems by sound and touch, the way they understand metal as a living material that bends and breaks and wears according to laws that can be learned. From them, he absorbs skills that no university of his era could teach: forging, welding, steam engineering, precision toolmaking, the language of metal and motion. And before he turns 18, Jean Garand files 2 patents with the United States Patent Office. 2 patents. From a boy who sweeps floors. A boy with no degree, no formal training, no mentor beyond the machinists at a Connecticut textile mill. One patent is for a telescoping screw jack. The other is for an automatic bobbin winding machine. Both demonstrate an understanding of mechanical systems that is simply extraordinary for someone of his age and background. Nobody outside the mill knows his name. Not yet. In 1909, at the age of 21, Jean Garand is hired by Brown & Sharp, one of the finest precision toolmaking companies in America, based in Providence, Rhode Island. The bobbin boy has become a professional machinist at one of the most sophisticated engineering shops in the country. 7 years later, he moves to New York City, working as a toolmaker by day and practicing his marksmanship at shooting galleries along Broadway by night. 2 passions, machines and firearms, are converging in the mind of a single man. He begins designing guns as a hobby. And in 1917, when the United States enters the First World War, that hobby becomes a vocation. The United States Army puts out a call for new light machine gun designs. John Garand, the self-taught toolmaker from Quebec, submits his design. It features a revolutionary primer-actuated mechanism, a fully automatic .30 caliber weapon, unlike anything the Army has seen from an independent designer. The War Department selects it. The prototype is not completed until 1919, a year after the armistice. Too late for the war. But the design is impressive enough that the government offers Garand a position with the Bureau of Standards in Washington, D.C. From there, he is transferred to Springfield Armory in Massachusetts on November 4, 1919. Springfield Armory, the heart of American weapons manufacturing since George Washington selected the site in 1777. This is where the muskets of the Revolution were made. Where the Springfield Model 1903 bolt-action rifle, the weapon that American doughboys carried through the trenches of France, was born. And now, this is where a Canadian immigrant with a 6th grade education will spend the next 34 years of his life. In 1920, Jean Cantius Garand becomes a naturalized citizen of the United States. The orphan boy from Quebec, the bobbin boy from the textile mill, the self-taught machinist. He is now an American, and he is given a mission that will consume him for the next 15 years. Design a semi-automatic rifle for the American soldier. 15 years. That is how long it will take. And in those 15 years, everything that can go wrong will go wrong. To understand why a semi-automatic rifle was revolutionary, you have to understand what the rest of the world was fighting with. In the 1930s and 1940s, every major army on Earth equipped its infantry with bolt-action rifles. The British had the Lee Enfield, the Germans had the Karabiner 98K, the Japanese had the Type 99 Arisaka, the Soviets had the Mosin Nagant. Every single one operated on the same fundamental principle. Fire a round. Manually cycle the bolt with your hand. Eject the spent casing. Chamber a fresh round. Fire again. That sequence took time. It broke the firing position. It slowed the rate of fire. For a century, that limitation had been accepted as simply the nature of infantry warfare. One man, one rifle, one shot at a time. While the rest of the world fought with weapons, their grandfathers would have recognized a civilian engineer inside an American weapons factory was designing the future. But the road from blueprint to battlefield would be longer and more painful than anyone imagined. And it would nearly be destroyed by a general whose name is still synonymous with the phrase, "I shall return." John Garand was not alone at Springfield Armory. At least 5 other designers were competing for the same contract. But his most formidable rival was a man named John Douglas Pedersen, a legendary firearms designer whom John Moses Browning himself, the greatest gun designer in American history, once called the greatest firearms designer in the world. The contrast between these two men could not have been sharper. Pedersen was famous, well-connected, respected across the industry. Garand was quiet, unknown outside Springfield, an immigrant with no formal credentials and no powerful allies. Pedersen worked with elegance and reputation. Garand worked with patience and preparation. Through the 1920s, Garand developed prototype after prototype. His early designs used a primer-actuated system, where gases from the cartridge primer cycled the action. In 1924, 24 rifles designated M. 1922 were built at Springfield. They were tested at Fort Benning against designs by Berthier Thompson, Pedersen, and others. Results were inconclusive. The Army changed its requirements. Garand went back to work. Then the Army changed the standard .30 caliber ammunition to a new type called M1 ball with a different primer. Garand's primer-actuated system was suddenly incompatible. Any other designer might have quit. Years of work erased by a bureaucratic ammunition change. But John Garand did not quit. He abandoned the primer-actuated system entirely and started over with a completely new gas-operated mechanism. And he made a decision that would prove to be the most important strategic choice of his career. While the Army was pushing everyone toward a new, smaller caliber called 276 Pedersen, Garand quietly developed his rifle in both .276 and the standard .30 caliber. Both versions. Simultaneously, just in case. Remember that decision. It will save everything. By 1929, 6 designers submitted rifles to the semi-automatic rifle board. Only 2 passed all tests. Both came from Springfield. The Pedersen T1 and the Garand T3, both chambered in .276. In early 1931, 20 T3E2 Garand rifles were manufactured and pitted against Pedersen's design in extended trials. The result was decisive. Garand won. Clearly. His rifle was simpler with 60 moving parts against Pedersen's 99. It was more reliable because Pedersen's design required lubricated ammunition that attracted dust and caused jams, and it was cheaper to manufacture. On January 4, 1932, the board officially recommended adoption of the .276 Garand and requested immediate production of 125 rifles. John Garand had won. After more than a decade of work, redesigned setbacks, and the kind of grinding patience that breaks most men, he had defeated the most famous firearms designer in America. The future was decided. Except it was not. Because one man was about to erase everything. Not an enemy, not a competitor, the Army Chief of Staff himself, General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur's objection had nothing to do with the quality of the weapon. It had to do with something that every war ultimately depends on. Logistics. The United States Army had millions upon millions of .30 caliber rounds stockpiled from the First World War. Browning machine guns across the entire force fired .30 caliber. Switching to .276 would mean new ammunition factories, new supply chains, billions of rounds of existing inventory rendered obsolete. And this was 1932, the Great Depression. Military budgets were being slashed to the bone. There was no money for a caliber revolution. On February 25, 1932, Adjutant General John B. Schumann, speaking for the Secretary of War, issued the order. All work on .276 caliber rifles and ammunition was to cease immediately and completely. All resources were to be redirected toward identifying and correcting deficiencies in the Garand .30 caliber design. For John Pedersen, this was the end. His rifle had been designed around the .276 cartridge. Its delayed blowback mechanism could not easily handle the higher pressures of the .30 caliber round. He could not adapt. His career as a military rifle designer essentially ended in that moment. But John Garand had prepared for this. That quiet decision years earlier to develop both calibers in parallel now saved everything. While Pedersen had nothing, Garand had a .30 caliber prototype waiting. He redesigned the bolt which had cracked during a test in October. 1931 improved the design into what was designated T1E2 and submitted it for evaluation. He did not complain. He did not protest. He went back to his workshop and he fixed the problem. The T1E2 performed brilliantly. On August 3, 1933, it was officially accepted as the U.S. rifle caliber .30 M1. There is a lesson in this story that men over 60 understand in their bones. Patience and preparation beat brilliance every time. John Garand was not the most famous designer. He was not the most celebrated. He was the most prepared. He had anticipated failure before failure arrived. He had built his backup before he needed it. And when the order came down to change everything, he was the only man in the room who could say, "I am ready." On January 9, 1936, the United States Army officially standardized the M1 Garand as its service rifle. 11 days later, on January 20th, 1936, John Garand transferred all patent rights to the United States government. No royalties, no percentage, no licensing fees. He said his civil service salary was sufficient. More than 6 million rifles would eventually bear his name. He would never receive a single cent beyond his government paycheck for any of them. But that is a story for later. Before the M1 Garand could change the world, you need to understand the one feature that made it unlike anything else on the battlefield. The feature that gave the American rifleman something no other soldier in any army on earth possessed. And the feature that made the weapon nearly useless in the hands of any enemy who captured it. The En-Bloc clip. Most semi-automatic rifles of the era used detachable box magazines. Load rounds into a magazine, insert the magazine into the rifle, fire, until empty, remove, insert a new one. Simple. Familiar. The American Army did not want detachable magazines. The military thinking of the 1930s held that soldiers could not be trusted with removable magazines. They would lose them. Damage them. Forget them in the field. The British Army had actually chained the magazine of the Lee Enfield to the rifle to prevent soldiers from misplacing it. So the Army demanded a self-loading rifle fed from the top using a fixed internal magazine. Garand complied. But he took the concept further than anyone else had imagined. The En-Bloc clip. The term comes from French. It means all at once as a whole. A simple piece of stamped sheet metal the size of a man's palm. It holds 8 rounds of .30 caliber Springfield ammunition in 2 staggered columns. When you load the Garand, you do not load rounds into a magazine and then insert the magazine. You press the clip rounds and all directly down through the open bolt into the internal magazine well. The bolt snaps forward over the loaded clip, chambering the first round automatically. Everything goes in at once, en bloc. When you fire the 8th and final round, a follower mechanism trips, and the action ejects the entire empty clip through the top of the open receiver. The distinctive metallic sound. Ping. The bolt locks back. Ready for a new clip. Slam one down. The bolt snaps forward. 2 seconds for a trained soldier. Back in the fight. The gas-operated rotating bolt system was the engine of this machine. When a round was fired, expanding propellant gas bled from the barrel through a port, pushing an operating rod rearward. The operating rod rotated and pulled the bolt back, ejecting the spent casing and stripping a new round from the clip. The soldier simply pulled the trigger again. No manual bolt action, no interruption, no break in the firing position. But the En-Bloc clip created something that nobody anticipated. Not the Army, not John Garand, not the men who would carry the rifle through mud and blood and fire across 2 oceans. The M1 Garand could not be effectively reloaded with loose rounds. Unlike a bolt-action rifle where a soldier could press individual cartridges into an open magazine, one at a time, the Garand required its specific clip. The clip was not merely a convenience. It was the heart of the feeding system. Without it properly seated in the receiver, the rifle simply would not function as a semi-automatic weapon. The American system worked because American logistics worked. En-Bloc clips came preloaded with ammunition packaged in cloth bandoliers of 6 clips, each 48 rounds. Ready to grab, ready to slam home. The clips were treated as disposable. When empty, you dropped them. When the fight was over, you grabbed more from the nearest ammunition point. Supply was the system. The clip only worked inside that system. Take the rifle out of American hands. Remove it from the American supply chain. And the weapon became in very short order a very expensive paperweight. This was perhaps the greatest security feature any weapon has ever possessed. Not a lock, not a password, not a complicated mechanism deliberately designed to frustrate the enemy. Just a simple, elegant piece of sheet metal, inseparable from the logistical system it was designed for. The most effective anti-theft device in military history, and it was created entirely by accident. In September 1937, the first M1 Garand rifles came off the production line at Springfield Armory. 10 rifles per day. John Garand was 49 years old. He had spent 18 years at Springfield, 15 of them focused on a single weapon. The rifle bore his name. It carried his genius in every machined surface, every spring, every precisely angled gas port. But a weapon is only a theory until it meets the enemy. And the question that nobody could yet answer was the only question that mattered. When this rifle faces real soldiers on a real battlefield, under real fire, will it work? The answer would come from a place no one expected. Not the fields of Europe, not the deserts of North Africa, but the beaches and jungles of the Philippines. And it would be written in blood. The Philippines. December 8, 1941. Local time. Half a world away from Pearl Harbor. Japanese forces are storming the beaches of Lingayen Gulf. The air is thick with the sound of naval bombardment. Landing craft grind against sand. Thousands of Imperial Japanese soldiers pour onto the shoreline expecting to face the same bolt-action rifles they carry themselves. The same century-old technology. Pull the bolt. Chamber a round. Fire. Repeat. On the beach, crouching behind a low wall of sandbags and coconut logs, Sergeant Dan Figuracion of Troop E 26th Cavalry Regiment, Philippine Scouts, raises an M1 Garand to his shoulder. He squeezes the trigger. The rifle barks. The bolt flies back on its own spitting brass. Another round chambers automatically. He fires again and again. No bolt to pull, no pause, no interruption. The rifle hammers out 8 rounds with the speed of a man snapping his fingers. Ping! The empty clip sails out of the receiver. Figuracion slams a fresh one home. The bolt snaps forward. 2 seconds. He is firing again. Sergeant Dan Figuracion is recorded as the first American soldier to fire an M1 Garand in combat. The weapon that had taken John Garand 18 years to develop, that had survived bureaucratic battles and caliber controversies, and a general who nearly killed the project entirely, was at last meeting its enemy. And the enemy had no idea what was hitting them. Japanese soldiers on that beach reported back to their commanders that the Americans appeared to be equipped with individual machine guns. Not heavy machine guns on tripods, not crew-served weapons. Individual soldiers each carrying what sounded like automatic fire in the hands of a single man. The reports were wrong in their identification, but perfectly accurate in their assessment of effect. The M1 Garand had entered the war, and it entered in blood. The situation in the Philippines in late 1941 was desperate. Japanese air attacks had destroyed American air power on the ground within hours of Pearl Harbor. Naval assets were shattered. Japanese troops landed with overwhelming numerical superiority. General Douglas MacArthur, now commanding American forces in the Far East, ordered a withdrawal to the Bataan Peninsula and the island fortress of Corregidor in Manila Bay. The plan was to hold until reinforcements arrived from the mainland. The reinforcements would never come. Not every American and Filipino soldier on Bataan carried an M1 Garand. Production was still ramping up. The regular units of the Philippine Division received them first. The 31st Infantry Regiment, the 45th and 57th Philippine Scout. Infantry regiments and the 26th Cavalry Regiment, all Philippine Scouts, were equipped with the new rifle. But many other units still carried the bolt-action M1903 Springfield. MacArthur had requested 84,500 additional M1 Garands to equip his entire command. The request was not fulfilled. Production was still too slow, but the units that had the Garand made it count. On January 10, 1942, Lieutenant Colonel Philip Fry, commanding the 3rd Battalion 57th Infantry Regiment Philippine Scouts, used M1 Garands to repulse a Japanese assault. The firepower was devastating. Colonel Fry's words were recorded in the military record, and they are worth hearing exactly as he spoke them. He said the Garand rifle was beyond his descriptive powers. He called the result a slaughter. He said the firepower of a battalion armed with modern weapons was something that defied his ability to describe. Think about that. A career military officer, a man trained to observe and report, said this weapon was beyond his ability to put into words. Not because of a single shot, not because of one brilliant moment, because of the relentless automatic unstoppable volume of fire that a battalion of semi-automatic rifles could produce. During the week of February 23, 1942, 3 of the most respected publications in America ran stories about the rifle. The Washington Post printed an article titled, "Bataan Proves Garand Worth." The New York Times reported Garand rifle praised by General MacArthur. Time magazine published a piece called The Garand in Action, describing the M1's combat performance as validation of everything its designers had promised. And here is one of history's great ironies. The man who sent that praise from Bataan, General Douglas MacArthur, was the same man who had nearly killed the M1 Garand project 10 years earlier by ordering the .276 caliber abandoned. Now from a besieged peninsula in the Pacific, he was sending official reports to the Ordnance Department declaring that the rifle had operated under combat conditions with no mechanical defects, that it had functioned in foxholes without jamming from dust or dirt, that it had been used in almost continuous action for as long as a week without cleaning or lubrication. The same general who nearly destroyed the weapon was now its most powerful advocate. History remembers the praise. It tends to forget who almost prevented the rifle from existing in the first place. Bataan fell on April 9, 1942. Nearly 23,000 American troops and more than 100,000 Filipino soldiers were killed or captured. The survivors faced the horrors of the Bataan Death March and years of brutal captivity. Before the surrender, those who could destroyed their M1 Garands to prevent them from falling into Japanese hands. One veteran later recalled that after hearing the order to surrender, he and Corporal Elmer Parks from Oklahoma drove a Dodge pickup truck back to their former position looking for supplies. They found something remarkable. Multiple M1 Garand rifles had been left behind by the Japanese. Not because they were damaged, not because they were broken. The Japanese did not want them. They could not use them. They had no American .30 caliber ammunition. They had no En-Bloc clips. The most powerful infantry rifle in the world lay abandoned in the mud of Bataan, because without American ammunition and American clips fed through American supply lines, it was nothing but dead weight. The En-Bloc clip had done what no lock, no code, no security device had ever done before. It had made a weapon useless to anyone outside the system it was designed to serve. Now let us talk about the numbers. Because the story of the M1 Garand's dominance is not told in anecdotes alone. It is told in mathematics. A trained American infantryman with the M1 Garand could fire 40 to 50 accurate aimed rounds per minute at an effective range of 300 yards. The German soldier with his Karabiner 98K, considered one of the finest bolt-action rifles ever built, managed approximately 15 rounds per minute under ideal conditions. The British soldier with his Lee Enfield, which had the fastest bolt action of any service rifle, achieved perhaps 15 to 20 rounds per minute. The Japanese soldier with his Type 99 Arisaka managed 10 to 15. The Soviet soldier with his Mosin Nagant, roughly the same. The ratio was not subtle. It was not a marginal advantage. An American rifle squad of 12 men, each carrying an M1 Garand, supplemented by one Browning automatic rifle, could produce a sustained volume of aimed fire that enemy commanders consistently attributed to a full company of 100 to 200 men. 12 men producing the firepower of 200. That was the M1 Garand's gift to the American infantry. And behind those numbers stood something even more powerful than the weapon itself. American industrial capacity. In September 1937, Springfield Armory produced 10 M1 Garands per day. By January 10, 1941, production had reached 600 rifles per day. By the end of 1941, the entire United States Army was fully equipped, and production kept climbing. Springfield Armory was joined by Winchester Repeating Arms, the only private manufacturer entrusted with Garand production during the war. Together, by the war's end, they had produced more than 4 million M1 Garands. 4 million. The German Gewehr 43, their best attempt at a semi-automatic infantry rifle, was produced in a total quantity of 402,713. For every 50 Karabiner 98K bolt-action rifles Germany manufactured, they produced one Gewehr 43. The Americans did not give the Garand to selected soldiers. They did not issue it to special units. They gave it to everyone. Every rifleman in every infantry squad in every division that went to war carried one. This was not merely a victory of design. This was a victory of production. This was the arsenal of democracy doing what no other nation on earth could do. Building the best individual infantry weapon of the war, and then manufacturing it in numbers that defied comprehension. By the summer of 1944, when Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, the supply shortage of 1941 was a distant memory. Every American infantryman wading through the surf on June 6, 1944, carried an M1 Garand, and the Germans on the receiving end of those rifles were about to learn a lesson they would never forget. German officers in Normandy filed reports noting the extraordinary volume of fire from American infantry positions. They described fire densities that they initially attributed to heavy machine gun emplacements, carefully emplaced pre-planned fields of interlocking automatic fire from crew-served weapons. They were wrong. It was riflemen. M1 riflemen. Individual soldiers in individual foxholes, each producing aimed semi-automatic fire at a rate the German army could not match with any weapon in its infantry arsenal. Picture a single American rifle squad dug in along a hedgerow in Normandy. 12 M1 Garands firing simultaneously. 40 to 50 aimed rounds per minute from each weapon. Total combined fire rate approaching 500 to 600 accurate rounds per minute. Now picture the German squad facing them. 10 Karabiner 98K bolt-action rifles. 15 rounds per minute each. Total combined fire rate 150 rounds per minute. The firepower ratio was nearly 4 to 1. Before counting the BAR. Before counting grenades. Before counting anything else. Just rifles against rifles. And the Americans won that contest so decisively that the Germans thought they were facing machine guns. The German military understood this lesson. They had been trying to close the gap. As early as 1941, they had attempted their own semi-automatic infantry rifle, the Gewehr 41. Two versions were developed, one by Walter and one by Mauser. Both were failures. Their complex muzzle-trap gas systems were unreliable, heavy, and prone to fouling. Their fixed 10-round magazines were slow to reload. Then something embarrassing happened. The Germans had to copy their enemy. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, as part of Operation Barbarossa, German troops encountered small numbers of Soviet soldiers armed with SVT-38 and SVT-40 semi-automatic rifles. The Soviet rifles were not perfect, but their gas piston operating system was far simpler and more reliable than anything the Germans had produced. Walther engineers captured examples, disassembled them, reverse engineered the gas system, and combined it with elements from the Gewehr 41 to create the Gewehr 43 in October 1943. The Gewehr 43 was a better weapon than the G41. It had a detachable 10-round box magazine that could be reloaded using standard 5-round stripper clips while still attached to the rifle. It fired the same 7.92 by 57mm Mauser cartridge as the Karabiner 98K, which simplified logistics. It was reasonably accurate and reliable when properly maintained, but its production told the story of Germany's failure. Only 402,713 Gewehr 43 rifles were produced between 1943 and the end of the war. The Wehrmacht intended to issue 19 G43s to each infantry company, 10 of them equipped with telescopic sights for designated marksmen. That goal was never achieved, not even close. Quality declined as the war progressed. Cheap materials replaced precision components. Exposed extractor springs caused jams unless the weapon was cleaned constantly. When parts broke in the field, replacements were nearly impossible to find. The M1 Garand was standard issue for every single American infantryman. The Gewehr 43 was a rare exception distributed to a lucky few. And even that rare weapon could not match the Garand's combination of reliability, simplicity, and sheer volume of production. But why could the Germans not simply use the M1 Garands they captured on the battlefield? They overran American positions. They found Garands in the mud and in the hands of fallen soldiers. Why not turn the enemy's weapon against him? Because the En-Bloc clip made it impossible. German standard ammunition was the 7.92 by 57mm Mauser cartridge, completely incompatible with the American .30 caliber Springfield. Even loose American rounds recovered from the battlefield were useless without the specific stamped metal clips to load them. The clips could not be improvised in the field, and the German supply chain had no mechanism to provide them. The Garand fit into nothing German, not the ammunition, not the loading system, not the logistics. Nothing. German ordnance manuals documented the M1 Garand. They described its physical characteristics, its ammunition, its basic operation. But documentation is not logistics. Knowing what a weapon is does not mean you can feed it. The M1 Garand was designed to be nourished by a specific clip loaded with a specific cartridge delivered through a specific American supply chain. Remove the weapon from that ecosystem, and it became the most beautifully engineered club in the history of warfare. Now there is a famous myth about this rifle that must be addressed. It has circulated for decades. It may be as well known as the weapon itself. The myth of the ping. When the last round is fired, the En-Bloc clip ejects from the receiver with a distinctive metallic sound, a crisp, ringing ping. Soldiers have described it. Veterans have written about it. It has become one of the most recognizable sounds associated with the American fighting man in World War II. For decades, the story has circulated that this sound was a serious tactical liability. That enemy soldiers could hear the ping, know the American rifleman was empty, and rush him before he could reload. It makes for a compelling story. It sounds like exactly the kind of design flaw that Hollywood would dramatize and veterans' bars would debate. And according to every credible study conducted during and after the war, it is almost entirely untrue. Consider what a real battlefield actually sounds like. In any genuine engagement at any tactically meaningful range, the noise of rifles firing machine guns, hammering mortar rounds, detonating artillery. Thundering men shouting, vehicles rumbling, and explosions tearing the earth apart. Creates a wall of sound so dense and chaotic that distinguishing a single metallic ping at any distance greater than a few feet is essentially impossible. The Army investigated the ping concern and concluded that the sound could not be heard or distinguished at tactically meaningful ranges over the ambient noise of combat. Furthermore, consider the tactical reality. A soldier going empty is surrounded by squad mates with loaded weapons. The window between an empty Garand and a reloaded one is approximately 2 seconds for a trained rifleman. For any enemy soldier to hear the ping, identify its source, determine that one specific American among an entire squad was momentarily empty, and then close the distance before the reload was complete. In 2 seconds, he would have to be standing directly beside the man. At that range, the ping is the least of anyone's problems. And in the chaos of actual combat, multiple Garands fire out of sequence. Pings come from different directions at different times continuously. Identifying which specific rifle just went empty is like trying to identify which raindrop just hit the ground during a thunderstorm. The ping was not a tactical liability. It was a ghost story. But here is what the ping actually was. Not for the enemy, for the American soldier himself. In the smoke and dust and deafening noise of combat, when a man cannot see his rifle clearly, when his eyes are on the enemy and his hands are working on instinct, that clear metallic ping is an unmistakable auditory signal. It says, "You are empty. Reload now." The soldier does not need to look down. He does not need to count rounds. He hears the sound and his hands move automatically. Clip out, new clip in, bolt forward, 2 seconds, back in the fight. The ping was not a weakness, it was a feature. A built-in status indicator in an era before electronics, before digital readouts, before anything except the sound of metal telling a man exactly what he needed to know. The Germans understood they were losing the infantry firepower race. Their answer was not another semi-automatic rifle. It was something entirely different. The Sturmgewehr 44. The assault rifle. Designed by Hugo Schmeisser, the STG-44 fired an intermediate cartridge, the 7.92 by 33 mm. Kurds shorter and less powerful than the standard Mauser rifle round. It used a 30-round detachable magazine, and it could fire both semi-automatically and fully automatically. Its effective range was 300 to 400 meters, sufficient for the vast majority of actual infantry combat engagements. The political story behind the STG-44 is extraordinary. Adolf Hitler initially ordered all new rifle development halted to avoid complicating ammunition logistics. The designers at Haenel, led by Schmeisser, disguised the project under the designation Maschinenpistole, 43 submachine gun 43, to slip it past Hitler's ban. When Hitler finally learned of the weapon's existence and was given the opportunity to test fire it in mid-1944, he was so impressed that he personally renamed it Sturmgewehr, which translates to storm rifle or assault rifle. That term, coined by Hitler himself for propaganda purposes, became the universal designation for an entire class of weapon that dominates infantry warfare to this day. Germany produced 425,977 STG-44 variants by the war's end, an impressive number given the short production timeline and the crumbling state of German industry. But context matters. More than 4 million Mi-1 Garands were already manufactured and already in the hands of every American infantryman on every front. The Sturmgewehr 44 was the right answer to the right question. It was in fact the direct ancestor of every modern assault rifle. The AK-47, the M16, the M4 carbine, every selective fire infantry weapon in every army on Earth traces its lineage to Hugo Schmeisser's design. But in the Second World War, the STG-44 arrived too late in too few numbers to change the outcome. The Garand was already everywhere. The STG-44 very existence is the ultimate enemy validation. Germany knew it was losing the infantry firepower war. It saw what the M1 Garand could do. It tried desperately to respond, and its response, brilliant as it was, came too late to matter. By the end of the war, approximately 5,400,000 Mi-1 Garands had been produced. They were manufactured at Springfield Armory and at Winchester Repeating Arms. Every American infantry rifleman was equipped with one. Every American rifle squad could bring to bear a sustained rate of semi-automatic fire that no other army in the world could match with individual infantry weapons. General George S. Patton, a man not given to lavish praise, a man who measured weapons the way a surgeon measures scalpels, wrote on January 26, 1945. Words that have echoed through 8 decades of military history. In my opinion, the M1 rifle is the greatest battle implement ever devised. He was not exaggerating, but there is one more chapter to this story. One more truth that must be told. It is not about the weapon. It is about the man who created it. About what America gave John Garand in return for the rifle that may have shortened the greatest war in human history. And about what America did not give him. The answer to that question will change how you feel about this story. And it begins with a number. $100,000. And a vote that never passed. More than 6 million fin. STG-1 Garand rifles were manufactured. They were carried by millions of American soldiers, sailors, and Marines across every theater of the greatest war in human history, from the jungles of Bataan to the beaches of Normandy, from the frozen forests of the Ardennes to the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima. A weapon that changed the fundamental equation of infantry combat. A weapon that many historians believe shortened the war by months. And John Garand, the Quebec-born son of a farming family. The boy who swept factory floors and taught himself on the shop floor of a Connecticut textile mill. The immigrant who became the most important weapons designer of the 20th century never received a single cent in royalties. Not one penny. Let us go back to January 20th, 1936. This is the date that John Garand signed the documents transferring all of his patents for the M1 rifle to the United States government. Every innovation, every mechanism, every detail of the gas-operated system that had taken him nearly 2 decades to perfect. He signed it all away. When asked why, his answer was recorded simply. He felt that his salary as a civilian engineer was sufficient compensation. But consider what that salary actually was. Garand was a federal civilian employee at Springfield Armory. When he became an American citizen in 1920, his annual salary was $3,500, a modest income even by the standards of that era. He was not wealthy. He never became wealthy. He lived a quiet middle-class life in Springfield, Massachusetts, in a modest home on a modest street. In 1930, at the age of 42, Garand married Nellie Bruce Shepard, a French-Canadian widow in Albany, New York. She had 2 daughters from her previous marriage. Together, they had a daughter and a son. A normal family. A normal life. While the rifle bearing his name was changing the world, the man who created it was living the most ordinary of American existences. Now consider the men who came before him and after him in the history of American firearms. Samuel Colt built an empire from the Colt revolver. He died one of the wealthiest men in America, leaving behind a fortune, a vast estate in Hartford, Connecticut, and a legacy measured in millions. Hiram Maxim grew rich from the Maxim machine gun. His invention was adopted by armies across the globe, and he was knighted by Queen Victoria for his contributions. John Moses Browning, perhaps the most prolific firearms designer who ever lived, received royalties from every design he sold. The Browning Auto 5 shotgun. The M1911 pistol that served the American military for 75 years. The Browning M250 caliber heavy machine gun that remains in service to this day, more than a century after its creation. Browning negotiated licensing agreements that made him and his family prosperous for generations. Even in the modern era, Eugene Stoner, who designed the AR-15 that became the M16 and eventually the M4 carbine, received royalties from Armalite and later from Colt. His design made him comfortable, if not rich. John Garand received nothing. His patents belonged to the government. Every one of the more than 6 million EM1 rifles ever produced generated revenue in which he shared no part. The most widely issued semi-automatic infantry rifle in history, and its creator's compensation was a government paycheck. Yet Garand was not entirely without recognition. The nation acknowledged his contribution, but the acknowledgement came in the form of medals and certificates, not money. In 1939, Garand received the Pynchon Medal from the Advertising Club of Springfield, the oldest public service award in the region. The citation is worth noting because it recognized something beyond military contribution. It stated that the production of his rifle had significantly reduced unemployment in Springfield and surrounding cities. The M1 Garand did not merely arm the military. It created jobs across New England during the Great Depression. Factories that had been idle came back to life. Machinists who had been standing in bread lines went back to work. The rifle fed families before it ever fed rounds into a chamber. In September 1941, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers awarded Garand the Holly Medal, recognizing the invention and development of the semi-automatic rifle bearing his name. The Holly Medal is among the most prestigious honors in American engineering. Previous recipients included Henry Ford for his contributions to mass production and Francis Hodgkinson for advances in steam turbine engineering. Garand stood among giants. He just did not have their bank accounts. Also in 1941, Garand received the Meritorious Civilian Service Award. And on March 28, 1944, while his rifle was being fired on battlefields across the world, Garand was awarded the Medal for Merit, the highest civilian decoration available at that time. He received it alongside Albert Hoyt Taylor, who had contributed to the development of radar. 2 men whose inventions were simultaneously winning the war, standing side by side, receiving the nation's gratitude. What is less well known is that Garand's contributions extended far beyond the rifle itself. He did not simply design the M1 and hand it to the factory. He redesigned the factory. He created new machining processes. new methods for grinding receiver chambers, new production techniques that increased output and reduced waste. Colonel Earl McFarland, commanding officer of Springfield Armory, wrote a detailed letter in 1943 documenting these contributions. Garand was not merely an inventor. He was a production engineer who understood that a weapon is only as good as your ability to manufacture it by the millions. He understood perhaps better than anyone the lesson that would define the American way of war. It is not enough to build the best weapon. You must build enough of them, and then enough more, and then enough more after that. After the war ended, a bill was introduced before the United States Congress. Its purpose was simple: award John Garand $100,000 as recognition for his extraordinary service to the nation. $100,000 for a man whose invention had been produced more than 6 million times. For a man whose rifle had equipped every American infantryman. For a man whose design, by the assessment of many military historians, may have shortened the most devastating conflict in human history by months. The bill did not pass. There is no detailed record of why. There was no famous debate, no dramatic vote, no impassioned speech for or against. The bill simply disappeared into the vast machinery of congressional business. Among the thousands of pieces of legislation considered in those years, the compensation of John Garand did not achieve sufficient priority. The man who designed the weapon that changed the war was not important enough for Congress to vote yes. Place that $100,000 in context. This was the early 1950s. $100,000 then is equivalent to roughly $1.2 million today. For a man whose invention generated billions of dollars in government contracts. For a man whose design may have saved tens of thousands of American lives by giving every rifleman a 4-to-1 firepower advantage over his enemy. Congress looked at that ledger and said no. Garand continued working. He did not complain publicly. He did not file lawsuits. He did not demand what was owed. He returned to his workshop at Springfield Armory and kept working. That is who he was. That is who he had always been. The boy who lost his mother at 11 and went to work. The immigrant who taught himself English on a factory floor. The engineer who watched a decade of work destroyed by a general's order and started over the next morning. John Garand did not stop. He retired in 1953 at the age of 65. In the retirement ceremony, Secretary of the Army Robert Ten Brock Stevens presented him with the 1,000,000th M1 Garand produced, a symbolic gift. Garand accepted it. One rifle, after 6 million. Before retirement, Garand had been working on the future. He contributed to the development of the M14 rifle, the weapon that would eventually replace his M1 as the standard American service rifle. The M14 was fundamentally an evolution of the Garand design. It used a detachable 20-round box magazine instead of the En-Bloc clip. It could fire in fully automatic mode as well as semi-automatic. It chambered the new 7.62 by 51 mm NATO cartridge instead of the old .30 caliber Springfield. But its operating system, its gas piston mechanism, the beating heart of the weapon, was John Garand's creation. The M14 carried his DNA. Garand was also working on something more radical. A prototype bullpup rifle designated T-31, a completely different configuration with the action and magazine behind the trigger group, a design capable of selective fire at approximately 600 rounds per minute. When Garand retired, the second iteration of the T-31 was unfinished. The project was canceled. The prototype was sent to the Springfield Armory Museum, where it remains a glimpse of a future that John Garand was not given the time or resources to complete. After retirement, Garand stayed in Springfield. He was a regular visitor at Springfield Armory, the place where he had worked for 34 years from the age of 31 to 65. He lived quietly. He did not write memoirs. He did not appear on television. He did not seek attention or celebrity. He was as he had always been, a man who preferred the company of machines to the glare of public recognition. In 1957, the last M1 Garand rolled off the production line at Springfield Armory. Garand was there to see it. The first had been built under his direct supervision in 1937. 20 years of continuous production, from the first 10 rifles per day to the thundering output of wartime manufacturing, and back down to the final unit. He watched the last one come off the line the way a father watches a child leave home, quietly, without ceremony beyond the private kind. In 1958, the M14 officially replaced the M1 Garand as the standard service rifle of the United States military. But the M1 did not disappear. It continued to serve with Reserve and National Guard units well into the 1970s. It had already fought through Korea, where it remained the standard American infantry rifle from 1950 to 1953. When North Korean forces poured across the 38th parallel on June 25, 1950, the American soldiers rushed to meet them, carried the same weapon their fathers had carried across Europe and the Pacific. A generation had passed, but the rifle had not. At the desperate defense of the Pusan perimeter, where outnumbered American and South Korean forces held a shrinking rectangle of territory against relentless assault, the M1 Garand was there. At the brilliant amphibious landing at Incheon, where MacArthur outflanked the entire North Korean army, the M1 Garand was there. At the chosen reservoir in temperatures that dropped to 40 degrees below zero, where Marines and soldiers fought their way out of a Chinese encirclement against overwhelming odds, the M1 Garand was there. Frozen hands worked frozen bolts. Clips were loaded with fingers that could barely feel the metal, and still the rifle fired. Still, it cycled. Still, it put 8 rounds downrange with the same mechanical certainty it had demonstrated on the beaches of Normandy and the jungles of Bataan. The Korean War proved what the Second World War had suggested. The M1 Garand was not merely a good weapon for favorable conditions. It was a weapon that functioned when everything else failed. After Korea, the M1 Garand was exported to American allies around the world as part of Cold War military assistance. The list of recipient nations reads like a lesson in historical irony. West Germany received M1 Garands. The weapon that American soldiers had used to fight Germany was now placed in the hands of West German soldiers to defend against the Soviet Union. Italy received them. The Italian arms manufacturer Beretta produced Garands using machinery transferred from Winchester, creating what became known as the Beretta Model 1952. Japan received them. The weapon that American Marines had carried across the Pacific Islands, fighting the Imperial Japanese Army at every step, was issued to the newly formed Japan Self-Defense Forces. South Korea, Greece, Turkey, Iran, the Philippines, Denmark, South Vietnam. Dozens of nations received the M1 Garand as America armed the free world against communist expansion. The rifle that had defeated the Axis now stood guard along the Iron Curtain, the 38th parallel, and 100 other frontiers of the Cold War. In 1973, John Garand was inducted into the United States Army Ordnance Corps Hall of Fame. The official citation read that through his initiative and instinctive inventive genius, the American soldier possessed a firepower superiority in World War II. He was 85 years old when he received this honor, a lifetime of work compressed into a single sentence on a plaque. 1 year later, on February 16, 1974, John Cantius Garand died in Springfield, Massachusetts. He was 86 years old. He was buried at Hillcrest Park Cemetery in Springfield, not far from the Armory where he had spent more than 3 decades of his life. There is no monument to John Garand on the National Mall in Washington. No museum bears his name. No statue stands in his likeness on federal ground. No school is named after him. No holiday marks his contribution. His name is known primarily to historians, collectors, competitive shooters, and the dwindling number of veterans who carried his rifle through mud and blood and fire. The men who owed their lives to his genius knew his name. They said it with reverence. They told their sons about the rifle and about the man who made it. But the nation that owed its victories to his weapon largely forgot the quiet engineer from Springfield who made those victories possible. But the M1 Garand did not forget. The rifle lives on. Military honor guards and ceremonial units still carry it. The crack of 8 Garands firing a salute echoes at veterans' funerals across America every day. The Civilian Marksmanship Program, a federally chartered organization, sells surplus M1 Garands to qualified American citizens. In 2018, the CMP received a shipment of more than 90,000 M1 Garands returned from the Philippines rifles that had been sent there decades earlier as military aid. They were inspected refurbished and offered for sale to the American public. Rifles that may have been fired in anger on the beaches of Lingayen Gulf. In 1941, that may have been carried through the jungles of Bataan. That may have been among the weapons Sergeant Dan Figuration and his comrades used in the first combat engagement of the M1 Garand, coming home after more than 70 years. Collectors treasure them. Competitive shooters bring them to matches and consistently demonstrate that a rifle designed in the 1930s can still hold its own against modern firearms at distance. Weekend shooters take them to ranges across the country and feel in the weight of walnut and steel something that belongs to the men who first carried them. Something heavy, something real, something earned. And when the last round fires and the bolt locks back, and a small piece of stamped metal sails out of the receiver and tumbles through the air, ping. Now let us return to where we began. A German soldier somewhere in France, summer of 1944. He holds an M1 Garand in his hands, a beautiful weapon, walnut stock smooth and warm, steel receiver machined to tolerances that German engineers would respect, the finest infantry rifle ever built, and it is completely useless in his hands. Not because it is broken, not because it is complicated, but because the M1 Garand belongs to a system that only America possesses. That system is not merely the En-Bloc clip and the .30 caliber cartridge. It is the entire chain of supply that begins at a steel mill in Pittsburgh and a walnut forest in Missouri and runs through Springfield Armory and Winchester Repeating Arms to a port on the eastern seaboard across the Atlantic, on a Liberty ship, through a depot in England, onto an LST bound for Normandy, into a supply dump behind the front lines, into a quartermaster's truck, into a bandolier on the shoulder of an American infantryman, standing in a foxhole with his rifle raised and his eye on the enemy. That system is American industry, American logistics, American organizational power, American democracy channeling the productive capacity of an entire continent into the hands of a single soldier standing in a single foxhole holding a single rifle. And at the center of it all, a small piece of stamped sheet metal, the En-Bloc clip, 8 rounds, 2 seconds to reload, and then back in the fight. Some weapons belong to the men who create them. Some weapons belong to the systems that feed them. Some weapons belong to the nations that build them. The M1 Garand belongs to all three, and no one else could take it away. John Garand, the orphan boy from Quebec, the child who swept factory floors in a Connecticut textile mill, the immigrant who became a citizen, the machinist who became an engineer, the quiet man who never demanded anything for himself. He created something that an entire nation depended upon. And when that nation forgot him, he did not complain. He simply went back to his workshop and continued working. Every American soldier who came home from World War II, every man who survived a firefight, because he could put 8 aimed rounds downrange in the time it took his enemy to work a bolt handle, once carried the genius of John Garand in his hands. And the last sound they heard before they reloaded the sound that German soldiers heard on 100 battlefields and learned to fear the sound that meant an American was empty for approximately 2 seconds before he was back in the fight. Ping! Then a fresh clip slammed home. The bolt snapped forward, and the battle continued, because the clip was always there. The ammunition was always there. The system was always there. And John Garand, the quiet man from Springfield, who never asked for what he was owed and never received what he deserved, had made sure of it. 8 rounds, 2 seconds, an American with a Garand. That was enough. It was always enough. Because behind those 8 rounds stood the full weight of a nation. The steel and the sweat and the ingenuity of a country that could take a boy from a Quebec farm, give him a factory floor, and watch him build the instrument of victory. That is the story of the M1 Garand. That is the story of John Garand. That is the story of America.